Grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, as we have gathered in the midst of his presence here this day. So we start out with a difficult question. Does God really care about your concerns? Now we immediately probably jump to some pious answer like, well, of course he does. But I want you to dig deep, and within most of us, there is this kind of place of doubt, of some uncomfortableness. We're maybe even afraid to ask the question because it feels blasphemous and God's going to strike us down or something. But go ahead, it's safe to go there and ask this question today, because I think that from what we hear in Scripture, we're going to have a lot of help for understanding how God really comes and intervenes in our lives. It's kind of a funny thing, and I don't know, it actually, people seem to say it works, and I will be honest, a couple of times I've done it myself. It's kind of a funny thing when you're in a parking lot of a type of store that has lots of people going there, and you pray, God, give me a parking place. And it seems like all of a sudden, boom, somebody leaves, and you get a parking place right by the door when probably you should have been way out on the other side and gotten some exercise. But nonetheless, that's how it seems kind of funny, but it works. Is God really in something so small as that? Does God show up? Now, the issue really is for us that sometimes it doesn't feel like God shows up for the really big stuff. My prayers don't get answered in the way that I thought they were going to be. Does God do miracles? What is a miracle? I think that's a thing that you need to define for yourself. And for me anyway, my definition of a miracle is it's any time that God intervenes in the midst of people's lives. So while we often look for miracles to be something really big, like someone gets healed of a terrible disease or something like that, we run the risk when we do that of missing out on all the many wonders that God shows up doing in our everyday lives, a myriad of miracles perhaps every single day, and to have that kind of mindset. It was fascinating in the last week. I had a number of conversations that seemed to play with this notion of God and miracles and how they happen in our lives and what's the role of us. And so hopefully you do that as well. If you have some sort of spiritual question in your life, and independent of each other 3 or 4 times, it seems someone brings it up to you, well, I would say God's probably speaking into your life, and you might want to pay attention. So this was keen to me for this week, and it really did kind of revolve around, do I have to somehow show God how hard I'm working at it, that I'm trying to be as good as I possibly can, so that he'll kind of like then show up, that's when he'll intervene. He'll say, good job, and keep it up, so to speak. But really, when you look at it from no less than Jesus himself, he says, I'm the great physician. So it is precisely at those moments of our vulnerability, those low moments, those dark moments, when God particularly shows up and purportedly then intervenes in the midst of our lives. And that's a vital way for us that we really need to internalize. Well, I was having a conversation like that, and it came to a close, and I really wasn't noticing, but there was a guy who I didn't know. It turns out he was a pastor who was getting bits and pieces of the conversation that I was having before with someone else. And so he approaches me, and he says, you don't believe in miracles because you're a Lutheran. And I go, well, nice to meet you too. No, actually, what I said was, you don't know me. And while that is true, and anyone that does know me knows I feel pretty keenly about miracles, and it gets to that very point where I am as genteel as I can with people when they say prayer is conversation, because lots of lay people say that, and even some of my clergy colleagues say that. But I'm only okay with you saying it's a conversation if you go, it's a conversation with God that brings to bear the very powers of the God who created the universe and brings them to bear in the midst of your life. And that it's the strategic kind of conversation then about how is God bringing about his kingdom and what is my role in it. If that's what you mean by conversation, well, I can live with that. But it isn't just, hey, Jesus, how's it going? Scored another 18 at golf this week? Because God always gets a hole in one, you see. There are 18 holes in golf. Okay, good. All right, just making sure we're on the same page. Golf is very boring in heaven, but that's okay. So, the difficult point for that pastor who came into my life was there was a very real way in which what he said about kind of Lutheran denomination and supposed mainliners in general is accurate, particularly over the last few decades. That it gets to that point where when I don't see my prayers answered in the way that I look for them, if I prayed for a loved one to live and that person dies, what am I going to do with that? That it's understandable. I'm going to run away because it risks my faith to journey down that and to come sort of face to face with God and go, what's the deal? Why did my loved one die? So you kind of go, okay. And it is still incredulous, particularly all these years later, for me to look back and to remember that that was how I was taught in cemetery. Yeah, that's funny. That's another old joke, and it's funny how many times we make Freudian slips, but that's another matter. In seminary, that it really was that uncomfortableness that said we don't see God working in the same kind of wonderful miracles that we see in the Bible. So evidently God doesn't do that type of thing anymore. It was safe to believe that, because then we go, well, we don't know exactly how. Maybe even it's an issue with humans, and you can walk down that road a little bit. There probably is some value in having that conversation and what we're really looking for. And that is the essence of really what I'm about in this sermon. What are you looking for? If you're looking for it, you will see God showing up in extraordinary ways. And here are some clues as to what that might be as we pick up on Jesus this day. So it seems that Jesus wanted an introverted kind of moment, wanted, as he often did, to go off by himself. But, I mean, can you picture this? So he even hops on a boat, goes out into the sea, but the people want to follow who at that point they understood, I think, clearly to be the miracle worker. And they go, oh, we're going to follow him. And so they're like marching along the beach, right alongside of wherever he is, out in the boat, going along. And then finally, he comes ashore. And by that time, there were 5,000 men, plus women and children, that in that patriarchal society weren't worth counting. Okay. But at least they are mentioned. In other places where it is the feeding of the 5,000, it doesn't even say plus women and children. So it is. But what that means is that they had a lot of children in those days, so there were probably at least 15,000 people there. It was quite a crowd. So there are two things we're going to look at as to what Jesus does. Now, remember, and Jesus will from time to time be clear about his focus, and he's always coming back to, especially after Peter will finally say, hey, you're the Messiah. And he goes, right, I'm the Messiah, and I'm going to be crucified, and on the third day I'm going to rise from the grave. That really messed with their heads for the longest time, and it still in many ways still does for us today. But we're not quite there yet. And he could have said, guys, I need a little time for myself, okay? You've just been stalking me. Leave me alone. He could have said, I know you have lots of earthly concerns, but I'm about the most important journey, the most important piece of human history that there will ever be, because I'm trying to save your eternal souls here, okay? To make sure you go to heaven when you die and not hell, all right? So we're on that path, all right? Could have said that. In this moment in time, he did not. And so for the best of what we can understand, he didn't even really teach at this particular moment. He didn't talk about his mission or whatever. He just healed people all day long. Why? Out of compassion. This wasn't his plan for the day. But the people come along and they say, Jesus, I've got this physical ailment. Heal me. And he does. So the first thing for us to notice, that evidently whatever your issue might be, even if you have an ingrown toenail, evidently Jesus stops whatever he's doing and attends to your concern. That's pretty cool and it's big stuff. But it doesn't stop there. So the day wears on. Jesus is just healing one person after another, it would seem. And so those poor disciples, the Bible goes a little bit out of its way, I think, to show that when they get driven by the Spirit, ultimately after Jesus goes off into heaven, that's when they get really excited and move in powerful ways. Right now, for 3 years as they march alongside of Jesus, they're just sort of bumbling. And so here we go again. The helpful disciples go, Jesus, you probably really should stop healing people, okay? Because they're getting hungry. It's, 5:30, and so it's almost dinner time, and they didn't realize how long we were going to be out here. They were just following along until you finally came ashore. And so they're miles away from home now, and so they need to go home and prepare dinner, okay? So just disperse the crowds. Jesus could have said, yeah. Maybe there were times he did in such times, but not this day. He goes, no, you feed them. And you can just see these disciples again roll their eyes. Jesus says, well, what kind of food we got? I got a few loaves of bread and a couple fish. And, in other books of the Bible that speak to this story, they will say it was a boy who had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Here it just says, that's what we got. Okay. And Jesus says, bring it here. We'll feed people. And they do. Everyone eats as much as they want. And not only that, but there are like 12 baskets of food left over. There is more food at the end after people ate all they wanted than there was before they started. So, compassion number 2 here tells us, this wasn't that people were starving. This wasn't a long-term hunger need for these people. This was just that they didn't have dinner. But Jesus stops and miraculously intervenes. And not only that, but blesses them more than they could have possibly imagined. And that's the things for us, that whatever you need from God, whatever your concern is this day, God's going to stop what he's doing and attend to that need. And not only that, that he will bless you more than you can possibly imagine. That you will be like that where you just have, I just got a little bit to bring you, Jesus, and you're going to end up with a whole bunch more left over after Jesus attends to that need. That's what we grab a hold of when we follow this Jesus. Those are big things. And there's no reason to believe that that is not true today. Well, okay. And we might even go, yep, yeah, we can do that. It's Sunday morning and away we go. But what about when Wednesday comes? And you go, what did that pastor guy talk about on Sunday? I don't know. Is it going to stick with you? Are you going to be ready for whatever nefarious thing happens on Wednesday? To grab a hold of those kind of confidences that God's going to show up, attend to your needs, despite whatever he had on his agenda of the day, and that he will bless you more than you can possibly imagine. Well, Jesus wanted to make sure the disciples of that day did, and so he put them into a little bit of a test. Had to know that there were storm clouds coming. But Jesus gets rid of the crowds and he says, 12 disciples, why don't you all get in the boat and we're going to go to the other side. But I still haven't gotten a chance to pray and I'll go off by myself yet today, so I'm going to do that first and then I'll catch up, all right? Again, what if you're a disciple? It's so crazy, us human types. So they've seen miracles all day long. And maybe they go, well, okay, this is a really nasty storm. Winds like we had last night, They were 63 miles an hour gusts or something. And this does not bode well. But all right, we'll go hop in the boat. All right. So they do, and it's terrible. They are not getting a wink of sleep that night. They're just bouncing around and they're praying, "Oh, God, save us." He lets them go most of the night. He shows up early in the morning. Now, he could have said, "Guys, there's a storm coming. Why don't we just camp out here for the night, and then tomorrow we'll cross the sea and do that when it's nicer weather," okay? Could have done that? No. He could have hopped in another boat and come alongside eventually. He didn't do that. He could have said that, "Hey, we got to get to the other side, and yeah, there's this storm coming, so I don't want you to be scared, so I'm going to hop in the boat with you, and then, I'll be there to calm down any storm." Didn't do that either. You always, when you're reading the Bible, need to ask, why was it done the way that it was done? Why didn't someone do what they could have done? This was a teaching moment from Jesus' perspective. And so what's he do? Oh, he is so Jesus. He decides he's going to walk on water. And evidently, regardless of however you feel about ghosts today, the people at that time definitely believed in ghosts. They thought Jesus was a ghost at this point, and after the resurrection, they'll think that he's a ghost too, and that's why he's got to eat stuff to prove he isn't a ghost. So here he is. They see him. They are cowering. They are praying. They are scared beyond belief. And so lo and behold, it's 3:30 in the morning, and Jesus shows up walking on the water in the midst of the wind. And so Peter, he begins to get it. He goes, "Why is Jesus walking on the water?" Okay. "Oh, Jesus, can I do that too?" "All right, Peter, our brash disciple, come on out. Give it a whirl." And it starts working. But then one of those nasty wind gusts happen. And for a moment, his eyes turn to the wind and away from Jesus. And he starts sinking. He goes, "Jesus, save me!" And Jesus goes, "Why do you have so little faith?" Boom! Plucks him up. And they hop in the boat. What are we supposed to glean from this? Sometimes people see in this, it comes off like that to an extent that Jesus is picking on Peter, and in a way he is. Why are you having so little faith that. But it is to have that sense that this is what God calls us to get out of the boat, because no one else did. The 11 other disciples, they're still cowering in the boat. When Peter starts sinking and Jesus has to save him, why didn't one of the other 11 go, "Hey, I can do better than that. Let me walk on water, Jesus. I'm ready. Put me in, coach." There you go. Could have. Didn't. So we often pick on poor Peter, but I don't think we should, because he was the only one that got out of the boat. And there's the thing, that God is looking for you to have that kind of confidence, that when you encounter issues of life, that whatever your need is, God will stop what he's doing. He'll heal you in however you need to be healed from his perspective, not necessarily yours. He will take care of all of your basic needs, whatever they are, so that then you can have the boldness of faith to say, "Well, I can go walk on water. I can take the risk of getting out of the boat and be a part of how God brings about his kingdom." Because that was the thing with Peter. The Bible is borderline mean when it comes to being transparent about the life of Peter. Peter had lots of faults, and we seem to hear every single time when Peter messes up, including Jesus is going to call him Satan one time. This does not bode well. I really don't want Jesus calling me Satan. But this is interesting because he's the only one that takes those kinds of risks. And how does Jesus ultimately see what he's about? Remember, his name really isn't Peter, it's Simon. Peter is the nickname that Jesus gives him. It means rock in Greek, Petros. And I like to say he was the first Rocky. And in that kind of fisherman sort of way, I think, it was, hey, Rocky, come over here. Okay. Why does he name him Rock? Because he was confident that that kind of behavior, that risk taker that half the time ends up looking really stupid, but the other half of the time does something that changes the world, is the one upon which the church is going to be built. He's the foundation. Where would we be without that risk taker, Peter? Because the church becomes the vehicle of God's activity. 2,000 years later, we are the benefactors because Peter was willing to say, Jesus, I think I can walk on water. Jesus says, cool, hop on out. And for us to be confident then that when we hop out of the boat, this is how Jesus builds his church today. This is how God builds his kingdom today. On the efforts of people who are willing to hop out of the boat, say, I'll try walking on water, Jesus. And to recognize that for us human types, there are going to be times when I'm going to get distracted by the wind and I will start to sink. And I know that God's going to pluck me out of the waters, dry me off, and say, okay, let's start this again. Those are the miracles. Every single opportunity that God comes and brings light into the midst of your darkness is a miracle. It was fun. Between worship services, one of our folks said that she should start writing down every time that she believes God does a miracle in her life. Well, that'd be pretty cool. Even the little ones. Anytime where you kind of go, well, that seems sort of interesting how that happened. Assume it was God and call it a miracle. Anytime that you have a voice that says, do this, and it is the best way for you to approach life, that's a miracle. Anytime that God intervenes in the midst of your life is a miracle. So, where do you need those miracles? Where do you need the compassion of God? Where are you vulnerable? Where are you fragile? Where is there darkness that you need light? Take a risk, get out of the boat, knowing that God has all the basics covered. He's going to heal you where you need it. He's going to take care of your basic needs so that you are free then to know that if God has my back, then I can jump out of the boat. I can try walking on water. And you might be, from your perspective, the only one around who's figuratively willing to get out of the boat. And to recognize and to lay claim to, but that's how God is bringing about his kingdom. If I want to be a part of that, then that's what this means. For me to take a risk. And so ultimately, who needs that kind of witness from you this week? What issue of life needs that kind of behavior from you this week? That kind of confidence and faith? Because we do live in a very dark world. There are threats. There are things that are working against God's bringing about his kingdom. There are all sorts of winds and storms. And sometimes you'll be distracted. And that's okay. Because God's going to come along. He's going to quit whatever he's doing. He's going to pluck you up and say, well done, good and faithful servant. Let's pray.